And what I would like to do is to open this up to everybody that's participating up there as well as the audience, and I will walk around with the microphone to ask questions and also to challenge. Yes.
Raised an issue, the difference between a status work and a contract work.
Okay.
You could argue, let me just finish the question, you could argue that the 2,700 or whatever it is were all contract work, that there was not one work of status, because perhaps people of status who have that capacity wouldn't enter that dumb competition.
Well, first of all, that's not true. Really significant.
We entered.
I mean, but I'm serious. Really significant
I
architects.
understand, but I'm saying is, from
Like
your
Hernan Diaz
research,
Alonso entered it.
how the
Top-notch
hell
people.
can you get?
Yes. Okay. Here's my argument is this. There is no basis for adjudicating, in any sense at all, I mean, you should look at the jury reports and the prizes. No one remembers Mark Wigley was the head of the jury. Jeannie Gang was his sidekick, and there were some local architects. There were no significant winners. No one knows the winner. I don't think the winners are happy to have won.
But is the thing going to get built, first of all?
No, it was an idea.
I think that's almost a more interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, but for me, like there was if you remember the Spreebogen, none of these people are old enough, but the Spreebogen competition in 1990 was 900 entries, which was unprecedented quantity of entries to a competition. Axel Schultes won it, it's built. Both of those are really horrible things to have happened. I mean, the fact that he won it and the fact that when you go to Berlin, it's built. And yet, when the book came out, no one could wait to buy it, because to find out what the state of the discourse was and what the nature of problems were, I mean, that was the most exciting thing. And stuff like landscape urbanism, tectonic, many of the themes of the 90s were born in that competition. Many people didn't realize that other people were working on the same topics they were working on. Lots of REM's things that were associated with REM were found out to be being done by other people. Axel Schultes' work was a neo-modernist work. We didn't realize that it was a trend.
Tell me, Jeff, what's Charles Jenks been doing all his life with these
Trying
charts?
to do these things.
Yeah, what's the difference between what you're talking about?
Well, the fact that Charles was, the fact that he was Linnaeus, that he was trying to do these trends, but if you look at the way he tried to do them, and if you looked at he had an idea about these kinds of categories when it didn't matter, when the debates were clear and I'll give you an example. When magazines governed the discourse, then editor filters made decisions about the discourse. Now that you mentioned that, for example, websites do that, they are non-edited. You see everything and anything. It's mostly if they can get material. If you send something in to enough websites, you'll get on. And there's 139 active websites right now. Bob Globson, I love that guy, but I mean, he does work every day. But you see something every day, and the commentary is virtually entirely about building performance and personal aesthetic opinion. That's it. That's the range of architectural judgment about everything. And so what's really interesting is how good people are becoming at building performance commentary. I mean, I think that's smart. There's nothing wrong with that. I like the fact that buildings are starting to perform better and better and better, and people know their technology better and better and better. But people don't realize, for example, Peter, that House 2, you knew it was going to leak, and that there was no that metal you stop stuff from
flashing?
No flashing in it on purpose. They thought you just didn't know how to build.
But
Okay,
just
I'm
come
sorry
in?
to interrupt, but I would like to open this up to other panelists as well as to the audience. Because I know Peter and Jeff can talk to each other all night.
Yeah, but he was just.
No, I was just trying to come in because very stimulating two presentations, and I feel that the Cambrian Revolution explosion is an interesting model. I would say it represents what happened post the crisis of modernism, mostly in the late 70s and 80s, perhaps in the early 90s, where you have the proliferation of directions, where you have, you have postmodernism, deconstructivism, neo-historicism, and onto minimalism, neo-rationalism, etc. But what we then witnessed, in a sense, is a condensation. A lot of this has been weeded out, and we have a convergence going on, but with an internal variation proliferating. So I think you could have also, so you have the explosion of, let's say, vertebrates, but the dinosaurs disappear. And I think that's the way to look at it. And I'm very interested, yes, there are a lot of nuisance and a lot of new trajectories which could be distinguished, but for me, most of them are and should be and will be in a new space of possibility, which excludes all the dinosaurs which are no longer viable. And I would start to call them the subsidiary styles and trajectories of parametricism, and there is a huge variety. Perhaps that variety within that spectrum is much larger than the whole of the history have brought up to this point, but yet a lot of it is excluded as well. It's not a free-for-all.
Okay, but then let me ask you a question. Let's distinguish between two possible notions, one of analytic parametricism and the other of synthetic parametricism. Because yours is a twofold parametric argument. One is parametric performance, which I think is absolutely fantastic, and you have championed it at every level, building level and architectural level. And the other one is a parametric style. So I could take any building, let's say it's stick style, and I can parametrize each element, and I can check its performance and be doing parametric architecture, and in principle be following your book. Yet you continue to champion the synthetic parametric half of your argument.
I would agree. I mean, there was something interesting you said, and nobody said it as radical as you just said it. Sorry. That when you are obsessed with sustainability and you're in an architecture school, you're probably in the wrong place. I mean, I think I paraphrased you correctly there. I think the same applies to some extent for parametricism. That if you're into parametricism and into architecture, you may also be in the wrong place, because the whole thing, if you look at what created the revolution of parametricism, let's say revolution in the computing technology, revolutions in the information technology, that is primarily a revolution in the information technology. Whether that is necessarily a revolution for architectural form, I don't know, because I'm often inclined to think the opposite. I think the fact that we know more about things, that we can produce almost anything, simply strangely enough allows things to stay the way they are, more than that they necessarily revolutionize form. I look at an object, and at a certain moment, all kinds of smart technology, all kinds of sensors, all kinds of blah, 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 allow me to know more about it than I did before that was there. To what extent does that constitute change? I mean, that doesn't change the object, it doesn't change me, but my relation fundamentally changed. Now, imagine you meet somebody, and I'm about 50, thanks for referring to me as a young man, by the way. I'm 50 years old, sort of in the middle of my career. And you meet somebody. You meet somebody that you may get romantically involved with. And you know there's been others before you. We all know that. I mean, we're adults, we're modern people. But then you go on Facebook, and then you go on every single Instagram thing, and then you see the faces of those who were there before you. And now we think, so then we think maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, and it's actually 83. And we kind of know, because, I mean, if you think about all the stuff you've been up to, it's kind of silly to think that it were three. No? I mean, it's knowing another like you know yourself. We now know politicians gossip about each other. We know politicians, you know. Ever since Kennedy, we know all of this. But there's a difference between knowing, and it fundamentally it changes our knowledge about things. And I think by constantly interpreting it as something that has a major impact on form, we sort of get blindsided to its real revolution, is the fact that it's not the things that change, it's the relation between things that is fundamentally changes. And I would almost argue for a kind of complete freeze frame in order to take stock of that properly, so because nobody knows. Every single smart technology, parametric conference you go to, nobody knows the future. I mean, the things I hear about it remind me mostly of biblical text. I have another presentation, by the way, of comparing text from the Bible about the apocalypse and blah, 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 to the kind of advertisement text of Cisco. It's remarkable. But that's in a way a feeling I have about it. You claim it's modern architecture. I think it's an old-fashioned insistence on form in a time when the revolutions are simply in other domains. Sorry, I mean to be the caricature of the
but can I
of your film, but
just let me help with this. It's really quite important because I have a theory of Peter and Jeff and Ranier slash Rem, and for me that's a dialectic of a necessary and important insistent that formal research, the expansion of formal repertoires, a language describing formal structures, spatial structures, is an important element in the evolution and innovation of the architecture. It's very, very important. And I think Ranier doesn't see it, Rem doesn't seem to see it. At the same time, I insist also, which the two of you are maybe blind to, maybe it's systematically blind to make your innovation so much more powerful, is that there is also a scanning of sociological trends, economic trends, the programmatic upcroppings beyond the canons of what we recognize as architecture, the periphery, the big, fat, ugly buildings, and all these things and what they mean. So that's also necessary. But somebody has to bring together and think together formal innovations, the expansion of repertoire with respect to addressing and mapping these onto these new phenomena, these new potentialities. And I think I'm the one who want to insist on that. Form works, form performs. Of course, initially there are these explosions where you think there's an exoticism of new forms, and when we first discovered computers, that was kind of nearly set free, and I subscribe to formalism, but there comes a time where these new explosion of formal possibilities are put to work, and they matter, and there is a difference. A box can never perform as intricately and sophisticated, put its feelers out and be responsive and sensitive and channel and structure and guide the contemporary complexity of society. So that's where I'm at. So I see the two of you as some kind of a necessary dialectic.
Yeah, who's the two of you?
Him versus us.
The four of us, you mean?
No.
Wait, hang on.
Thesis, antithesis, I'm the synthesis.
I mean, this is
But let
working
me,
out the way you planned it.
let me ask you about this performance, okay? Because I think give me the correct pronunciation of your name.
Reiner. Sorry, should I be the expert on my name?
But you got Peter.
Reinier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that Dutch?
It's Dutch, yeah.
And what is
It's
it
about
on
as Dutch. Auf Deutsch it is Rainer.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Auf Deutsch is Rainer.
I guess I thought it said Rainier made it illegal to discuss in the United States since he's so highly eroticized it with his love life. Plus, I don't want to mention my numbers, but I'm going to change it to a slightly.
You're older, huh?
And then Teo will, of course, want to say something. We have to call on Teo. He won't just wait, you know. But I think what Patrick and what Rainier just said have to be put together exactly. He said form performs, and he said form performs, but do we want the performances, who knows the right performances? I do think that's absolutely right. And so 15 years ago, when digital work was in its naive moment, mass customization was thought to be the trajectory of architecture, like it is for shoes. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we were all thinking about the ribbon window, the quarter turban window, and you know, and so you would see all these various windows, or you see all kinds of things where there would be a different something for everybody within the same familiarity. And so what this was a kind of high celebration of individuality within community. We were all individuals within a large community, and your work does that continuously. You think that is the self-evident, bona fide political performance of an architectural form. The more and more I think about it, the more and more I think about stuff like the Teatro Olimpico, I think architecture, that is the worst possible project for architecture. Architecture should not do that. Architecture should not celebrate individuality. It should enforce collectivity, say, for example. Enforce a uniform collectivity, or at least enforce a kind of benign order, because right this second, what's happening in the cities is a total dissolution of the fabric of civil polities. In other words, you don't walk down the street anymore with the contract of civility with polities that you don't belong to intact. You live in a city of 1 million people, 2 million people. You know you don't know everybody. You know you're not the same religion as everybody. You know you're not the same ethnic background. So the idea of a polity is long gone. But there has been for a long time a contract of polities. Each of those people belong in a polity, but you're all American, you're all Chicagoans, you all live by a certain code of benign civility. That's gone away. So now we're living in a kind of fragile system of estrangement. And when architecture first comes into its own, it's when communities of proximate exchanges replace familiar exchanges, and it was there to enforce civility. And
It still does that and should do that.
it should do that, but if you keep celebrating everyone's individual entitlement, I know this is a martial function, but I'm just saying we have to have a discussion about the role of the performance. So I like it or not. I mean, you could be on one side, you could be on the other side, but you can't just say architecture performs and I know it's right performance.
I think the right performance of an individual institutional project, which invites an architect to translate that into kind of a spatial offering, this judgment is made by the client, and they have to be convinced. And in the end, the market and the success of the building in real life will be a verification or refutation. But what we have to do, we have to at least get the right concepts and tools, analytics, and repertoires, synthetic and creative repertoires, into gear. Which brings and upgrade our intelligence to have a better chance to deliver towards that. And that's, I think, and that starts with analysis of society. We confronting all sorts of clients all the time, so we have direct, real, practical experience with what society requires of us. But we read and write and experience and theorize, use social theory to understand it better, classify it, and guide ourselves within this. And I think we live in a whole cluster and network of differentiated polities, which could be highly specific and in this kind of the multitude of quite different social situations and offerings spreading across the urban space. That's society for us, but we need to navigate and refine relevant partners of communication where we then, and the environment will tell us what the social codes are, which are respected, and to structure a discourse, make a specific communication institution possible. That's very important, but everybody has to learn at least some very, very generic, so it's kind of gradated, very finely differentiated, but also then a system of hierarchies of generalization where everybody knows by now what it means to be in a very, very public, general space, moving through an airport, what the do's and don'ts are there as well. So there's also universally shared, and that's globally shared, protocols of interaction. And at the same, so that's what we're addressing. And that's the program of architecture.
I have a question for you. You said in your talk, and because you don't sound, I have to say that whether it's Rainier or Rainer, that I agree with what he said. Is you said we have to show that parametricism is a compelling superiority, a life-enhancing advantage.
Yeah.
And I say, I never teach my students about life-enhancing advantages.
Yeah.
I teach them about form making.
Yeah.
And when I go, I'm sorry, I want to make sure we understand.
Yeah.
When I went to see the painting of Piero della Francesca, I don't care about life-enhancing advantages. That is a life-enhancing in itself.
Yeah, but with the discipline doesn't care, it annihilates itself. So that could be.
That's not true.
You could, Peter. You can be that. Take that position, and I validate this. In the division of labor of the discipline itself, I think there need to be protagonists who specialize in formalism,
But
formal
not
discourses.
architects.
But that can't be the total story, because society needs an evolving and a built environment which works and delivers. And if you, yeah,
What I find so strange, and here I'm going to try to make an analogy with something you said a long time ago. On the one hand, you argue for the autonomy of form and for the superiority of form. At the same time, towards the end of your talk, you show behavioral patterns that you analyze, from which you deduct form. And then what you do, because I mean, brilliant form, if you argue form of autonomous, form is partially autonomous of use. So now, you've spent the better part of your life enjoying that, I think. And when it's either that or it's not, you know, because what the smart city and all these kind of things do is they analyze our behavioral patterns at any given moment, and they cast them in stone, they eternalize them until we become the prisoners of the straitjacket that those cast in stone behavioral patterns have become. Now, you once spoke about intruders, and I love that. It was inhabitants, no, we have intruders, which is wonderfully provocative. Richard. Intruders in a case when form is autonomous from use. Any form of use becomes an intrusion of form. Now, what the smart city does, it creates its own intruders by the autonomy of function, by taking random function at any given moment, autonomizing it, supposedly like a glove catering to human use, but at any other moment that human use becomes an invasion of the functions it supposedly created itself. And that is a very interesting full cycle thing, and I can't get my head around it, because I think there is a fundamental, I mean, it's almost of a Wittgensteinian beauty, you know, that the latter half of your lecture is essentially a denial of the first half, and I just don't, but maybe Jeff gets it. But
Yes,
I mean, you're the biggest advocate of pluralism.
wait, let me just try to do it because of a directly addressed. 1 second. No,
1 second.
It's very coherent. I'm not claiming the autonomy of form as its own discourse. That's what Peter and Jeff are doing. I'm into the instrumentality of form and compositional repertoires, but in order to have something to become instrumental, I have to kind of proliferate and put it in front of me as a set of choices. But the work is totally coherent. The behavioral patterns and interaction scenarios you'll see in the end use precisely the kind of repertoires of space making, dynamic curvature, complexity, open interpenetrating forms, which I've been advocating through the images and through the work. So this comes coherent, and then it also becomes fluid and responsive, so the parameters are becoming malleable. But there is no autonomy of form here setting absolute. This is always about form empowering function.
Okay.
Theo.
We'll be back to that. Yeah, there you go. Theo. His protege.
Okay. So, I mean, for me anyway, I think there's a bit of a problem with terms of reference. So, for example, the way that you speak about the smart city and the way that you talk about parametric design, one could also throw in your approach to diagrams and your approach to actually working through this kind of legibility.
Absolutely.
So at some moment we have to make differences that make a difference, and with that I think it's important to talk about, let's say, some of the complexities that are really at hand, because you seem to want to sort of pause everything with an idea of trying to catch a litmus test of what's going on there, and I think Jeff showed a taxonomy of things that don't necessarily have this kind of idea that there is a blueprint of the past that will serve as a way of understanding the future. And so I think at some moment, I think that there is a complexity. I think form is a participant. And I think to a degree, everybody here works within that formal project. There is a behavioral project, which is actually looking for architecture and its communication devices and its instrumentality of how that can actually become something that's more shared and collective. And I don't know, I think Peter mentioned something between star systems and the heroic, or the heroes. And I think that this is a really important thing, because I'm not really sure that people believe in heroes anymore. Like, I could say I'm pretty old school in the belief
In heroes.
that there should be. Because in a certain way, those are more about projects than people, and those people actually had a certain accountability with that. What I find today within the kind of contemporary conversation is a bit of indifference, a lack of actually trying to move between, let's say, what you posed as sort of black and white, where we actually started to see these diagrams that Jeff was putting up there, which actually said there is a manifold of differences, but some of those differences don't necessarily render themselves, and they will become obsolete. So I feel like it's very difficult to sort of try to take stakeholding at this moment in time.
But I think sorry.
First of all, what I would mean by a hero, there were teachers. There were teachers who could draw all the things they were talking about. In other words, they knew enough. And to me, to be able to give to a student, say, hey, let's look at the plan of the Teatro Olimpico, and let's understand what the problem is of this building that Jeff showed. And I would argue we've lost that heroic kind of behavior. There are very few teachers today that can draw anything, know anything, can see anything. And I do believe that society, and Jeff and I have talked about this many times, architecture is one of the few professions that denies its heroes. I mean, my son, who works for Major League Baseball, is saying that baseball is in trouble because they don't have any heroes. The basketball has heroes, football has heroes, soccer has heroes, but baseball has lost their heroes. And I think every discipline needs heroes.
This sounds like Trump. So we don't have victories anymore. We used to have victories, but we don't have them anymore. That's
Right.
I was
That's why we're
thinking.
going to make him president.
Yeah, I know. You better. But I was thinking,
And I
what
hope
is the
Europe
difference?
just gets what it comes to.
But ever since you
Wait a
mentioned,
second. Listen, hang on.
sorry.
Let me leave one stone not unturned. Let me leave one unturned stern.
Unstern.
Yeah,
Very
I
good.
very much want to talk about Bob Stern in here. Peter Eisenman does do work on form without regard to program, without regard to the effect. That doesn't mean there is no effect.
Right.
Okay. So some time ago, when I was telling, I used to think my job was to understand very difficult work by architects that were working in arcane manners and try to sort of become their interpreter. Then I realized that wasn't my job. That my job was to figure out what were the performances of this work architecturally beyond what they were doing. And so Peter and I are tied at the hip as closely as two people can possibly be, and I'm proud of that, but we are not the same. And my sense of what his project is deeply political, deeply performative in a sociological way. I think he likes to hear it. I think he doesn't believe it. But when he's working on the autonomy of formal processes, you don't use a 4-square grid, you use an I-square grid because a 4-square grid leaves an unoccupiable center. You don't know why people shouldn't be in the center.
Because it's the power position.
We're so, oh my God, I can't be in the center. But, but let's say he autonomously screws around with a grid and it puts puts a column in the middle of a doorway. Another architect would take it out because it's subordinate to the program. He'll leave it there, and then you can't get your bed in. You can't, all kinds of bad stuff will happen. And then I'm posed with a problem of, okay, what good does that do? I have to answer that question. That he didn't have to answer the question. He had to get some idiot to build it.
Hey, Jeff, can I,
Hang on,
I
I'm
want to
gonna
add
answer my
something to
questions.
what you, look.
Wait, let me finish.
Okay, go ahead. I thought you were finished
I know.
about the idiot to build.
If you walk up to that and you see that column, and not only see that column, but you begin to pay attention enough to understand why it's there, you are paying attention to a building in an entirely different way. You are paying close attention to the building. The building cannot seduce you into any other performances. If you walk into a cathedral, and the cathedral is designed, or a museum, in such a way as that you are forced to pay close attention to the architecture cannot put you in the position of accepting the obedience to the priest, for all those reasons that you know what will happen after that, or to the art that they decide to put on the wall. You don't have to think it's important, because you are now paying attention independently. You are not seduced by architecture into submission. And architecture's most important role, look around you, is to seduce you into submission. Gigantic spaces with fantastic ornamentation. We're sitting here above you. You are submissive to us at this very moment. And so this is what I think his work contributes to an accomplishment of, but I do think every building demanding close attention every second of the day is just a god-awful prospect for the world.
And there are none.
There aren't that. That's right. So there is this
Jeff,
idea.
let me ask you, let me throw something that you threw at me this week. And I want to raise this because it throws the discussion into a different way. If we were to argue that Alberti, in his De Re Edificatoria, his 10 books, was preempting Newtonian physics. In other words, he had a theory of homogeneous space, parts
We're just
relating.
taking it for granted.
Yes. Well, he was preempting in the sense that Newton didn't exist until a couple of centuries later, but Alberti wrote the discourse for architecture, let's say. This is why I want to get on a wicket, which I think is interesting. So, Jeff says, why don't you read this little book about quantum physics? And I started to read this thing, and I said, hey, if in fact everything up until quantum physics is Newtonian, what is the role of space and time in relativity, quantum mechanics, etc., that nobody seems to be taking into consideration at all? In other words, the true breakthroughs as they were in Brunelleschi's time about perspective, about drawing, about ratios and mathematics, Cartesian grids and things, it would seem to me that someone would stop for a minute and say, what about quantum physics? What does it mean for architecture? And I'm just curious, since you had me read this little book, and maybe I misread it, but it seemed to me to say, how come we're still teaching Newtonian physics?
We live in it.
What? Tell me. Why do we live? Why do we live in it?
I mean, why do we live in Newtonian?
No, why don't we live in quantum physics?
We're not small enough.
Exactly. We're neither small enough nor
There
large
isn't a good enough diet yet, but
I think I want to say,
I think the question.
I think the meaning of architecture, including Alberti's and the theory, in a sense, is quite specific and validates this, has to be immanent to the life processes which is accommodated within it. It can't be projecting cosmologies, etc. I think that went wrong when the first time the semi-logical project came about within postmodernism.
Let me answer the question, your question, a slightly different way. Because you understand why you should not read books, because this is the kind of
Why you shouldn't read books?
You should read books. You should
Not
just
physics.
not draw conclusions for you cannot learn to do architecture from a physics book or a sociology book.
You can think architecture.
You can learn from anything that gets you excited about it, and then, like, if you love bridge, that's good enough. You can do your architecture from a bridge book. It just, I don't want a billion architects, or I don't want 100 million architects reading one philosophy book. I need 100 million architects do their own reading, and then I get 100 million readers reading 100 million different things, and then I get to survey that work and then
What a
draw.
waste of time.
Yeah, I understand you think that,
But I sit there and look at your diagrams, and I hear you talk about Alberti, Brunelleschi, and I think the real confusion, the real lethal confusion that there is that the current proliferation of styles and ideas and individual signatures, that we mistake them for breakthroughs. You know, you talk about breakthroughs.
But
there are some, but no, but
wouldn't you
let
say we
me
mistake
finish.
them for breakthrough? I mean, I just want to know, who are you talking for?
The general mood in architecture, and in as much as I experience it, it's maybe presumptuous to act as a spokesman for it, but let me finish
Okay.
the thing. Yeah, that sometimes maybe a long time passes between one breakthrough and another. That was always the case. Maybe that is still the case. But somehow the market economy forces everybody into postures of extravagance where we now have a breakthrough for each architect. I mean, it gets to a point, if I extrapolate your diagram to the ultimate conclusion, we will have 1 million one-man practices, which are all geniuses, but they won't have an audience, because their audience is not by themselves being a genius as well. And that is the fundamental toxic, because you talk about a break of collectivity. It is exactly that. It is,
But
you know, the
Ramir,
difference between a store.
does that financial situation need you to take care of it, or will that not take care of itself?
I'm sure it will take care of itself.
It
but
has
I mean,
already taken care of itself.
well,
Look at the number of people that are not going to the Helsinki website. Look at what a gigantic failure that was,
Yeah, but I
for
think
exactly the reason you just said.
But I think I mean, yes, things take care of themselves, but I think that's also somehow a feeble excuse to ignore them, because I'm sure the power of architects is extremely limited in other domains. Does that give you an excuse to ignore those other domains? I'm sure our own power is extremely limited, but it's able, the power we have is that we're in the middle of trends which we can articulate and hopefully, you know.
For me, I think architecture is not like a weekly movie. It's not like this is a good movie, that's a bad movie, and you've done somebody a favor by saving them $15 or $25 or $100. I think architecture.
But it is exactly that according to the diagrams you show.
Except how
It
much
is
it costs.
exactly that according to the diagrams you show. I mean, you're
Okay,
beginning to sound like Patrick.
You made your point. I accept
Well, what's
your
missing in
point.
the diagram? What's missing in the diagram is the selection process, the convergence, the validation process,
Yeah.
the fall off, the extinctions. It can't but just be the explosion itself.
I didn't say the explosion itself is to try to tell us how we should spend our critical effort now. Are spending our critical effort now to say, here's the choice you should make, and here's what's wrong with the other choice, is a waste of effort. The critical effort
Can't
we
be.
should.
If
Okay.
it can't be,
What
then
I
we really
think we should
then
do
we're really cynics and
is to point
and
out
irrational play.
Are there any questions from the audience,
we
by
need
the way?
We need to put the audience. I was just
Is to
Absolutely.
point
It's
out
time to
the
put the audience
positive effect of the intelligence that's manifesting itself.
Please just
If
raise
you
your
can
hand
do
and I'll
that,
come to you.
You've done something extremely valuable. I can
There
do
are
that.
plenty of questions
Plenty
out
of
here.
questions. Gentleman with the beard.
Let's have some questions.
All right, so this is kind of focused to Patrick, but I guess it more or less applies to everybody. So I was wondering if Patrick's comments on sort of the demonstration of superiority of certain, at least specifically he's mentioning parametricism, but I guess that applied to all the technology involved, if this sort of explains why almost all of your short pieces of work are posted on Facebook and why it seems like you're trying to bring the architectural discourse to Facebook or to social media, and if that's a way to get away from what Jeff described as sort of like the typical shallow responses to what is currently posted on most architecture websites.
Well, I try to use any means necessary, and I think there are different media and different levels of conversations. So I do love Facebook rather than Twitter, because I can make an argument, I can run 500, 1,000 words, and I'm interested in responses and then coming back. But there's also, essay length contribution, there's lectures, and there are treatises. I mean, there are books. I think the books are still necessary, because you need to have also build up a more comprehensive synthesis where you cash out and fill out some of those promises and make arguments more elaborate. That would be, but I find it very, very productive, the Facebook experience in media. And magazines are far too slow in many levels. Yeah. But there's also, it's not a breakthrough every half year. I agree with that. And we need to really try to identify these breakthroughs in this whole panoply of proliferating options and start to filter. We need to take a stance, we need to qualify, and that's something which becomes problematic because we're so much used to this kind of brainstorming pluralism, forgetting that brainstorming has a purpose to first of all have initially a kind of free for all, but then to take stock, filter, classify, and draw conclusions. And somebody needs to start doing this, and there's a kind of polite resistance to doing this, and that leads to a kind of fallacious irrationality.
So this is probably an unfair question, and more of an observation. And being one of these dinosaur faculty members who probably doesn't know anything and just trying to educate some students in something. But there's a lot of bravado up here, and it's curious to me, and I don't know why, that there's no women up here.
Wait,
And what I want to...
The reason is they charge too much.
Yeah. What I am curious about, and this would just be all speculation, but I'm curious as to how this discourse would be different if there were some women up here and we had that kind of perspective and a different attitude. Because one thing I can say after teaching for many, many years is women bring a completely different sensibility to the discourse. And it seems to me that there's an exclusion here.
But why are you asking us that question?
Because...
And why aren't you saying African Americans, people of color,
well, we can
lesbians?
say everything.
But you didn't.
Mexicans. Yeah.
Hey, listen, I've been
and
teaching
so
for
it's such
40
an obvious.
years.
It's such
I
a.
have 10 women in my class and 10 men. The women do
Peter,
better than the men.
Peter, hang on.
And what are you talking about? Now I'm going to make a gender distinction? That's a bunch of junk.
I want to answer that.
Okay.
So I'm the person who organized it. I'm a woman. And I just happened to invite my heroes, whose projects I admire.
I love women.
So that's the answer to that.
Talking about.
I spoke about women.
What I want to know is, have you ever written about women for an architecture publication? Do you know if any of us have? There you go. So you really don't know much about what you're talking about, exactly like you just said. So a little bit of bravado goes a long way.
I have a quick question for Patrick, actually. When I was looking at the parametrics that you were showing, I also did some of my own research before coming into this. The parametrics in your designs, is it as a means to break away from bureaucracy, like where you have people from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, just force them to interact with each other? Is that like what you meant by the parametrics and the different, not diagrams, but different approaches that you go through in creating your spaces?
Yes, I think you put your finger on something important. I think modernist institutional designs and buildings have bureaucratic structure in terms of separation of serious departmental functions and sub-functions. They're neatly divided and separated out. And within each of them, there's kind of repetition. So I'm saying separation, specialization, repetition. These are the principles of modernism, modernist architecture, even applied to the city with the different zones and districts. And these were the principles of modern bureaucracies, both in governmental administrative institutions as well as corporate bureaucracies. And that alignment is important. That's the way I always want to read the epochal styles like modernism relative to epochal or socioeconomic epochs. Fordist, mechanical mass production era, for instance, of the first stage of the industrial society. And we're in a different world right now, and that's not something I invent and impose. If now somebody like Google comes to us or other corporates, they're very, very different. They have fields of multiple populations intersecting, self-organizing. There's a lot of external consultants flowing in and out. There is gradients, overlap, interpenetration, continuous evolution of spatial scenarios, and we've worked on these with students at Harvard and AA and elsewhere. And if you look at the proposals, for instance, which Heather Big, for instance, delivered to the new Google campus, it's a different world. It's a sponge space, a continuously differentiated field space, and just to say that these intuitions have been growing a long time, and these breakthroughs are rare. So I can say these things, and the intuitions were put forth by both Peter and Jeff by now nearly 20 years ago, and they need to be worked through, cashed out, elaborated. And I have a long trajectory on this. I don't believe in kind of monthly flashes of genius. I believe in cumulative elaboration of these pertinent, historically pertinent, profound intuitions which emerge within the discipline, and we've been working with. That's what I believe. But then there's also, of course, enormous amount of variety and sub-articulation within that as well. So thank you for the question.
Hi. My question is about contextualism, and I just wanted to ask, many very successful architecture firms have a certain style, a formal style, and when the world is so, not just one site in every city is different, but every site is different. My question is, why is it that firms that have a particular style are more successful than firms that don't have a noticeable style? Anyone?
Well, I know the answer, but I mean,
Enlighten us.
Because if you have a style and you sell your style, you're easy. It's like, why do you buy a Chevy, rather than why do you buy a car you can't identify? Particularly in relationship to contextualism. And contextualism, remember, architecture hasn't always been about context. Contextualism is a 40-year-old idea. It has always needed to be about location in the sense that it's fixed to the ground. But the idea that you would diagram a context and relate to the context actually is a fairly mid-20th century idea, and has to do with changes in construction and changes of how buildings are built and what they can do, how you can relate to an outside building. So it's a mid-20th century theoretical idea and ways to relate to it. And it had a lot of success. So European contextualism and American contextualism. And so it was incorporated into both professions and turned into a value structure that almost everybody outside of architecture knows. So go look for a client who is really good at relating the building to the context. What's happened, however, is two things. One is the context transforms very quickly now. And so the likelihood of a contextual intervention maintaining its relationship to the context, particularly in cities, is increasingly unlikely. And secondly, buildings that are put into the context often are the instruments of changing the context. So buildings that come in and are strongly contextual oftentimes are the motivators for transforming the context away from that contextual. So the contextual apparatus has now been incorporated and started to become its own undoing. And so these style boutiques, and they're quite good, it's a little bit like being building type boutique. If you're going to go into business in America, I don't know about this in Europe, but you go in as a building type boutique. Like, for example, right now, American offices are specializing in university buildings and in legal buildings because they know that the market for those buildings are going to be the most. And they're very so you have wings of your office specializing in those skills because that's the most practices are going to get built. So you specialize where the market research shows you're going to go, and then you optimize your relationship and your presentations to that. That's a very good thing to do if you're interested in business, which I think is an important thing to be interested in, and it's a very important thing to do to understand how the building type works in relationship to that. The short-term and intermediate-term effects you have to study, and that's why contextualism has basically disappeared as a significant long-term building, professional building type value, and totally disappeared as an academic discourse.
I tend to disagree with this. I think contextualism is now an a priori condition of everybody's work to be a respectable contribution to contemporary architecture, and I believe in such new standards. Best practice standards include contextual sensitivity, affiliation, embeddedness. That's an a priori, and Parametricism delivers this.
Nobody thinks
that's and we should collectively in this have such values and share such value, and to largely we do. And that's.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Did you see the Frank Gehry building I showed? Do you think that was a contextual building?
No.
And it should be criticized for its lack of.
Wait. Did you see it, and do you think it was a contextual building?
No. He's asking her, a woman. Yeah.
But do you understand that it is a contextual building, that it's about the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, it's about the downtown, it's totally contextual. Its form is derived exactly from all the curvature. 100% of the curves in that building are derived from the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion.
You are actually serious.
Yes, I'm 100%, and I can,
I
can show you this.
But
if that is a
Jeff,
contextual
Well, wait a
building,
second.
this is not about a
I
theoretical
understand,
demonstration.
but wait
This
a
has to be
minute. Hang on. Let me just
phenomenologically
finish
palpable.
this argument.
I mean, I'm hearing this correctly.
This is hey, wait, let me just say, this is exactly what Patrick thinks his buildings are doing when
Yes,
he
I
says
agree
they're
with that.
contextual.
Yeah, and
Is
but
that right or not?
Absolutely,
This
that's
is
the
the design
intention, and I think
Gehry
our
did.
projects are doing this much
is how
more.
you do it. Yeah. Let me
No, no,
show
no.
you. This is I'll do you a Gary.
Did you?
Hey, did you watch the slideshow or not? Did you watch it or not? You can see the curvature.
I can see the curvature. I can see curvatures all over the place. I see curvatures in every Gary building.
let
And
me
if
put
that
it
is a
this way.
contextual building,
Just because
then
you don't know
every
anything
then every
about it
context
doesn't
is the
mean it's
same.
not true.
Well,
I know
I mean, I
for a
thought that.
fact that the
But I
curvatures
thought that
are
was your.
exact.
But that was your opening statement.
The curvatures
Deliberately
are
not
exact.
knowing anything.
Let me mediate with this. I agree with Rainier on this one. I agree with you, and I don't think it's enough to have a theoretical demonstration. It needs to be phenomenologically, perceptually palpable. But I would also at the same time say our project have the ambition to be more embedded, and I think there are more contextual embedded, and I'm happy to receive criticism if it isn't sufficiently achieved.
No one on earth thinks your projects behave in a contextual way.
I think
like
I can. No, you have
except
to.
me.
Except you.
You know. But I want to make another point. The question was about signature styles of architects, and I think they're overemphasized. We have the kind of architect's illusion that this is relevant out there in the world, and it isn't. Out in the world, these things, these characteristics and signature presences will be attributed to the client. The meaning of what the later means, Google Campus will be Google's invitation, space, demeanor, culture, and nobody would think of Heatherwick and Big. They're not interesting. We know these characters. But also, out in the world, a lot of these, the different architects who are working in the Parametricism, they're diffused, they become part of one overall direction with a sense of contemporaneity. And I believe that. And I think on a subjective side, we actually don't want to be locked in the signature style. Signature styles on the subjective side is basically a constraint that we can't be versatile and light-footed enough that we're kind of locked in by default to certain constraints which make us recognizable. We don't like that.
So on that note, I'm sorry,
No, one more question.
we don't get to take a
Do
break.
you know, or have you ever seen any Peter Eisman building?
Who?
Okay, you've never been to one, but do you know any, like through publication or anything like that? You. Wexner Center, doesn't matter, any building at all. Do you think it's contextual? Do you know every element of every Peter Eisenman building is derived from a deep reading of the context.
Can you deny this?
Can I put it back on the wall and show you? I'm sorry you haven't been taught well. Is that guy behind you your teacher? Oh.
Okay.
Patrick, let me ask you as a last
Yeah.
question.
All right, so
How
on that
can a
note,
parametric building be contextual if its processes and conceptualization is different from the context in which it's placed? How is it possible to say that parametricism will lead you to a contextual building? See, I don't. It seems
I know there is temporarily there's a certain tension.
there's a tension,
There's a tension.
which is I'm for that. by the way. Anyway, I'm for it, but you can't say they're contextual.
But given the fact there's a new repertoire which makes these buildings stand out more than they ultimately will and should, with these new repertoires, they try to then affiliate, be sensitive, responsive, be deflected, and informed by axes, views, volumes, trajectories, etc. But then, of course, there's a limitation. There's a tension there. Clearly.
Hey, can I say one thing about this? Do you guys know why you don't get taught proportional systems anymore? That for 400 years, from Alberti to Le Corbusier, every architect learned proportional systems and harmonic proportions, and you don't learn them. Do you know why this is? Does anybody in this room know why it is? First of all, I just want to know if anybody knows why.
I'm sure you're going to tell us.
Everybody up here knows.
I know why.
Well, let me ask you something. Do you
I know why.
They're desperately afraid to say yes.
I'm not. Do you know why?
Yeah, let's get this over
Yeah.
with. We need a break.
Okay.
I do.
I don't want to just get this over with. I know you do, and I know you do, Peter. I want to know if you know why, or if you have a guess, or have an answer at all, anything whatsoever.
First of all, I don't agree that proportional systems are over.
Okay. But here's why. Because of construction methods and analytic methods, proportional systems make the building body-centered. It relates to itself in its part-to-whole relationships. More and more and more in the 20th century, construction systems, buildings could relate to other buildings and other relations in the context. And so more complex relationships between a building and its relationship could be made, which took it outside of its internal relationships, and that's what architecture got interested in. And this happened starting mostly in the 30s and 40s, and got particularly important in the after World War II period. So diagrammatic formalism, Schiff, Scheer, Casa del Forest, all the possibilities of a building relating to its context, producing new urban and local spaces that were learned already in place from Schinkel. I mean, it's not that it didn't happen before. These became more and more possible because building construction became more and more agile, and proportional systems fell away for two reasons. That became a possibility, buildings became more interesting, and the construction systems, the building of building components made it more and more difficult to customize proportions. And so those two things collaborated to
Well,
put...
what about parametricism as...
Well, I mean, if you don't know what happened to
production
proportional
method.
systems, then you also don't know about contextualism.
Well, what about parametricism as an
You should at least
evolution
have
of
thought
proportional
about,
system?
how come
What are
I'm
we
reading
talking
about proportional systems in every text I read, and I see it all the way up to modular, and no one's teaching it to me, and you're supposed to think to yourself at some point in your life, as a teacher or a student, what happened to it? Don't you think? I did. So yes, somebody's supposed to have thought about it, and it's the teachers that are supposed to be thought about it.
It goes back to Peter's question about quantum physics.
Right.
No.
So, for example,
How's that got to do with it?
Sorry, Jeff.
I'm going to say it from this perspective. I think sometimes our understanding of the world is obviously based on a certain form of knowledge, and in a certain point, perspectival and all of these other human proportionally systems were the way that we sort of related to the world. Today, in a more contemporary place, scale, for example, is something that is very abstract. Money, currency. We're living in a kind of hyper-real moment where one can say that the conventions of time and space have been collapsed on it. Has become more real time, has become more instantaneous, and maybe part of the contemporary project, if there is one, is to sort of create a form of resistance to this, because in a certain way where Peter mentions that everything is disseminated and everything is everything all the time, the nature of actually how we start to construct our understandings are also changing. So it could have been a project like Powers of 10 from Eames, which was trying to talk about the infinitesimal small to the most galactical, but we're starting to realize that, we don't need science fiction today. Reality is a very radical project, and it's very difficult for us to situate ourselves into much more of this kind of contemporary form of interaction and instantaneousness. And I would say, from being maybe someone who is at the moment trying to work through these problems, that there is a lot of uncertainty and latency. And it was sort of spoke about bravado, but I think a lot of us are trying to work through these problems by understanding that there really isn't a blueprint for these things, and context is not necessarily just appearances, but we're trying to explore ideas and try to speculate on what that actually means today. So I think space is a very active medium for how we could define architecture today, but that doesn't necessitate that building is actually the answer to that problem. So there is a lot of questions that are on the table, and I hope that the conversation could expand on some of these things so that we can consider actually some of these questions. I don't necessarily think that ideas are just sort of breakthrough ideas. I think they're a continuous evolution, and seeing it through the filter of architecture also gives us, I think, greater legibility towards that, or at least in a way for you to operate within that world and take decisions. It's like my short form answer, hopefully.
So let's give these folks a big applause.